Cumberland traffic, Copeland 4041 uniform, departing 11, rider and tail.
The canopy goes down and the canopy just sort of nestles, you can almost feel it on the top of your head, so you're really right inside it. The cable is connected, you hear the sort of rattling of the ring, but then the acceleration just comes on like you wouldn't believe, and you're airborne.
Welcome to Soaring the Sky, a glider pilot's podcast. My name is Chuck, and I'm your host, coming to you from the Mid-Atlantic region here in the United States and flying with the Cumberland Soaring Group. This is episode 74. Thank you for joining us for another aviation adventure and guest pilots. Two great guest pilots will be joining us. But first, a big thank you to our biggest contributor to the podcast this week, Zach from Maryland. Thank you, Zach. With donations like his and other Patreon pilots that continue to contribute to the show, it makes it possible to continue to bring you great soaring content and helps to cover some of the cost. If you would like to help us out financially, you can go and support us at our website, soaringthesky.com. If you can't help us out financially, but you would like to help us out, we would greatly appreciate it if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcast or on your favorite podcast app. This episode is sponsored by the Southern California Soaring Academy, a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in the high desert of Los Angeles County. Soaring Academy is dedicated to growing the sport of soaring with young people through its 8th grade STEM outreach programs and giving back to PTSD-afflicted veterans during private monthly events. Flight lessons and mountain soaring are available year-round to the general public, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. To learn how you can get involved, check them out on Instagram and Facebook at Soaring Academy or online at SoCalSoaringAcademy.org. First on the podcast today, Daniel Sazhin joins us to talk about his latest blog, A Tale of Two Air Masses. It's our SkySight tips and techniques segment. If you want to check out SkySight, you can do that absolutely free. Matt Scudder has given us a coupon code, all caps, Soaring the Sky. Daniel Sazhin, welcome back to Soaring the Sky. Glad to have you again.
Glad to be here.
So I was reading your blog, really was enjoying the most recent blog. I believe it's called A Tale of Two Air Masses.
Indeed.
And there was a lot going on that day, so can you tell us about that?
Well, sure. I like to go and write about a number of things, and among them it's some of my more memorable flights. And this was a very memorable flight for me because in the summertime, particularly in August, in the Northeast, typically the soaring conditions tend to be pretty touch and go. And if you're able to stay up for a couple hours, and even if you don't go anywhere, that's usually a pretty good deal. And it's kind of hot and muggy, and you just sort of sweat under at 3,500, 4,000 feet, and that's just the way it is. And this day kind of looked like that. It certainly followed that, was very much like that, and I just sort of came out and figured I'll just go and take the Duck Hawk out and do a couple takeoffs and landings, maybe try to stay up for a little bit, and that's that. But then as I got up and worked my way up to cloud base at 3,200 feet MSL. It took me 10 minutes to do that. I just sort of plodded along over the ridge in a cloud street, and I looked over my shoulder, and I figured, well, the high ground looked like it ought to be working a little bit. It was just clouds were a little bit higher out there. And when I got out there, I found a completely different air mass. And while the forecast said that the conditions ought to be a little bit better over the high ground, I didn't expect the cloud base to rise, 2,000 feet in the span of a couple hundred yards, and that was really, really cool. So when I connected with that, I recognized the convergence, and it was driven by a trough. And northwest of the trough, there was really, really good air, and I just wandered off into Pennsylvania and made a 280-mile flight. And and flew for 6 hours when I really didn't expect that. And I've certainly had long flights and things like that, and flown long distances. But it's particularly exciting when you get to explore new terrain, and when you're doing it when you're on days that you don't expect to be soaring like that.
Absolutely. Now, you left from Blairstown,
Yep.
New Jersey, is that right?
Yep. That's Blairstown and Aero Club Albatross. That's kind of my home base, and that's where I've been flying for the past 15 years. And like I've gotten to explore the four corners of the task area from Blairstown.
Right.
So, and this was extending on that a little bit.
Now, as I was reading, you were heading west, I believe, right?
Yeah, and heading west is pretty interesting and a little tricky from Blairstown because we are to the northwest is the Pocono Plateau, and kind of to get a lay of the geography, it's you have the Alleghenies and the Poconos and the Catskills, and they're all part of this kind of ancient mountain system that eroded out, and you basically just have this. The foundation of it is just this really hard block of plateau. That's all that's left, and not much of it is cultivated, other than in some of the deeper valleys. So it's not very landable, and so it's particularly tricky to normally head out into those places, but they typically have somewhat better lift, and on a day with less wind, and which is as it were, and on days that you have pretty good cloud bases and preferably a high performance glider, which the Duck Hawk certainly fits the bill on that front, then you can take advantage of the better soaring conditions out in these places. And so I really haven't flown all that much into these areas, and if I have, it's always kind of been more on the edges and things like that. Not really penetrating too far into the high ground. But here, I worked across the Poconos very nicely, and going into the Allegheny Plateau, which is, on the far side of the Allegheny Plateau is Harris Hill, for example, or if you go west along the plateau, you get to Rich Soaring, Julian. And I've never really successfully managed to work my way into the plateau before. Anytime I've ever gotten up there, the cloud base normally was a little too low, and it was a little bit too windy, and the number of times I've been up there, I've normally had to turn around, or I once managed to get beyond it and then went back over the plateau. So I had a tailwind and 9,000 foot thermals and things like that, and the lift was better, obviously, but that was the way I negotiated this big unlandable area. But here the conditions were quite good and quite high and not windy, and so it made it possible to get in there, and that was really, really cool. And the lift worked really, really well.
When you started out, I believe when I was reading, you had like a half knot at one point.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's I released and I settled down a couple hundred feet and then started climbing, and it took me 10 minutes to get from 2,200 feet to 3,200 feet, and that was cloud base. My vent is all the way open and I'm sweating, and it's I mean, what are you going to do? It's just one of those kinds of things, and the first 45 minutes of the flight, it was just like how I'd expect a day in August, right? And then all of a sudden it's like someone flicks a switch and I'm in a completely different world. It's hey, well, and I'm just going along, and I figured,
right.
Hey, well, I guess I'll keep going, man.
So then it got much better, and at some point,
yeah.
I think you said you were looking at the radar, and there was a pretty rough thunderstorm. Now, was that back in Blairstown?
Yeah, so I actually didn't know anything about it, which was which made it all much more entertaining for the folks back at home, because everyone there saw this big thunderstorm come up, and it just kind of raised, just went right over the airport. And what happened was where the two air masses came together, the New Jersey Blairstown air mass was much more humid and hotter, and then well, I guess it wasn't so hot, but anyway, it was there was a lot more moisture associated with it. So when that weak northwesterly good air, dry air crashed into that air mass, it just started really kicking off. And when I left, there was a little shower that formed off of off to the northeast of where I was in relation to into the Poconos, and I didn't really think all too much of it. But that sucker just developed into a really, really serious thunderstorm. And the thing is because it was consistently fed in from the northwest, it really it kept building and building, and it really didn't move all that fast. So the airport was under heavy rain for a couple hours with the storm.
Wow.
And before the storm, before the storm came, everyone landed. They didn't. Which is all good, but I mean, I was gone, man. I mean, I was heading the opposite direction. I didn't know anything about this happening.
Where's Daniel, right?
And it was well, hey, I was. And by the time, and the thing is, when I came around to come back, the air mass, it was very highly variable, and it was working very well over the high ground, but in the valleys, it really was pretty soft. And so I got a nice climb over the Alleghenies, and I was about 70 miles from home, and I almost had final glide even then, but that got me a long glide to the high ground just northwest of to the Poconos again, and the trough was still working at that point, and at that point I picked up another climb, and I worked the trough back and forth for 50 miles, which I've never done before out there, at least, and so that was really cool. And then at the end of the day, I had a dead glide coming back home, from the northwest, and and as is typical with when a storm comes through, afterwards, when the ground is drenched, the ground really cools off, and especially when you don't have all that much wind, it gets completely still. I mean, the air had no movement to it at all, and and it's one of these things. When you get to do a legitimate dead glide, and I dialed the McCready back to 0, and I had plenty of additional margin for altitude, but I figured I'm in no rush to come back at that point, right? And it's just the glider is perfectly smooth, the air is perfectly smooth, and you're just gliding along. It's just a marvelous feeling. You just don't get to experience that very often at the end of a day like that. So
the thunderstorm's pretty rough. So everyone's back at the airport, and they're the ones that are out there landing and probably trying to figure out where you were. And then I guess when you finally land, is anyone there?
Hardly anyone, everyone's scattered. There was one fellow, what we call young Kevin. He works at the commercial operation, helps out there, and has a 126. Great fellow, young guy, just like me, and he was just enjoying the later evening on the porch of the shack, and he came on over, and he told me everything that happened, and I got out of the glider, and the ground is all squishy. I was like, oh, that's not expected. And it's everywhere. It's just the airport's soaking wet.
So you left, I believe you said around noon, and then when did you land?
Oh, I landed at a little after 6.
Wow! And then how many miles did you go, or kilometers?
I flew about 280 miles thereabouts.
Nice. Wow.
And most of that in the latter part of the afternoon, when it was slow going in the earlier part of the day, kind of working my way into the high ground and things like that. But then the moment I turned around, it was glorious. I mean, up in the Alleghenies, it was even much higher and better than I expected. I started climbing up, and I get to 6,000 feet, and the cloud base was 7,000 at the edge of it, at the plateau, and that's really good. And I'm climbing, and the clouds are not any closer, and the thermal picks up to 6, 7, 8 knots, and I climb up to 9,500 feet.
Wow!
And with that, you can get home pretty quick. With the true airspeed and the tailwind, it's just hey, that's everything you can ask for.
Yeah, it set you up for a nice glide home.
Yeah.
So your blog, Soaring Economist.
Indeed.
Yeah, I do enjoy that, and I'm going to put some show notes here so people can definitely check that out.
Yeah, Well, one of the things that people are always kind of perplexed by is, why is it called the Soaring Economist, right? In a sense, and it's one of these kind of funny things. He's like, why am I talking about, a soaring flight going off into the, out into the wilds of Pennsylvania on a blog like that? And what ended up happening was I. So there's a couple things. Number one is a number of years back, I started getting interested in things like behavioral economics and cognitive psychology and how it relates to decision making, and those and that kind of approach to psychology and economics, for that matter, it looks at things from a more of a quantitative kind of perspective, and it's a more of an economist approach to things, right? And so that, and in the beginning, I was interested in sort of I used it very much exclusively for just kind of jotting down my thoughts as to how like soaring relates to, or rather how certain kind of psychological economics concepts relate to soaring and decision making, and then with the idea that some of those things can then kind of work their way into other kind of bigger research interests. And at the same time, I would occasionally write up my flights on Facebook with pictures and things like that. And in the blog, it was less. It was on Blogspot or something like that, but it wasn't all that sophisticated. And I really didn't like Facebook for sharing long write-ups and lots of pictures and things like that. So I just figured I'd just combine the two, and so I did. And my professional interests, they kind of went more from absolute, more more the strictly economics and things like that to more in the cognitive neuroscience psychology side of things. But hey, man, the name stuck, and so here I am. But I think it still works.
It does. I enjoy the pictures that you put in it too. I mean, you can kind of go along with the journey as you're telling the story, and the pictures with it. That's pretty. You even have a picture of the radar there that looked pretty intense. You said there was like maybe a tornado warning in that too.
Yeah. Well, the folks that took that picture, that was done. That was done by a fellow that was looking at it while everything was going on. I didn't know anything about that when I was flying. I don't have any radar or anything like that in the glider. And
probably better you didn't, right?
Hey, it was like, hey, ignorance is bliss, man.
Right.
I didn't have to deal with any thunderstorm.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
You get back, the ground's wet. What happened, right?
Yeah. Well, it's hence a tale of two air masses, right?
Yeah. Right. What were you flying? I know you mentioned it, but can you tell me a little bit about that glider?
Sure. I was flying one of three Windward Performance Duckhawks, and it's an American-built glider. And it's kind of a very special ship, and it was built up in Oregon, and Bill Farr was the one who owned it for a while. And Bill, in his infinite generosity, decided to basically give me the ship. He just straight up donated the glider to me last year.
Wow, nice.
And I mean, that's as they say where I come from in Brooklyn, that's an offer you cannot refuse. Yeah. So and I was, and I've been flying it since, and kind of tuning it up and tweaking it and flying it and it's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful airplane. Really, really, really cool airplane.
What is the glide ratio?
It hasn't been explicitly measured, and so I am, I need to preface that because it's one of these kinds of things. When I look at the theoretical in the manual is 50 to 1 at 60, 63 knots or something like that. Okay. Is it really? I don't know. It's really hard to measure absolute glider ratios like that. I can say, I've flown it quite a bit when Bill owned the glider because he let me fly it since 2014, and it goes as well as any other really good 15-meter glider. Climbs well, and where the glider, when you get into kind of wafty air, an 18-meter glider with the big, the longer tips and the winglets can just, if they're flying along at 50, 55 knots, they just seem to kind of do a little bit better there. But at high speed, the Duck Hawk just does unbelievably well. I mean, it was really, really, really designed around going fast. And the other thing is it's got electric flaps and it's got automatic flaps. And one of the maybe the Nixus probably has automatic flaps, but aside from that, it's the that and the Morgan's Sparrowhawk R. But the automatic flaps make a meaningful difference, and between the wing and the airfoil and the flaps, it handles dynamic air really well. So if you're going to go and fly along in a cloud street or in a convergence line, or maybe on a weaker ridge, a strong ridge you don't care really, but on a weaker ridge, and it pulls more energy out of the gusts. And if you're flying in a long line for a long time, just the flaps being consistently in the perfect position and adjusting correctly for each acceleration that's incurred upon the glider, that makes a meaningful impact on the performance. And of all the things that the glider has, a lot of really, really cool stuff and a lot of really interesting engineering ideas, and Greg was just a brilliant guy. But of all the things that I think that it demonstrated, as far as I'm concerned, I think the automatic flaps are a huge, huge win on the glider.
So you said they adjust themselves then as you're flying?
Yeah, it basically. So in the flaps, they're electric. So and the way it works is the ailerons they're flaperons. So if I move the stick, left and right, then it just moves the whole trailing edge of the wing up and down. And
okay.
The flaps, were really nifty. Where how they work is there's just basically a big servo and a piston. Like I guess it kind of looks like a piston. I mean, maybe it's a. So someone who's an electrical engineer could be maybe more precise in calling what the motor thing is. But what it does is it just goes up and down, and what it serves to do is it just pulls the push rods in closer or further apart. So, and that's how the flaps work. It just that when the motor extends out, then it just it pushes the flaps down, and it doesn't interrupt the movement of the stick at all, and vice versa. And so it's actually it's a pretty straightforward, simple system there. But then the Morgan's idea, as far as I know, I'm pretty sure it was Morgan that developed the auto flaps, was, well, if it's electric anyway, then all you need to do is hook up a couple sensors in a computer that knows what the airfoil, what the polar is at any given speed and G loading to infer angle of attack. And so it's got a box that takes in a pitot connection, and it's got a couple accelerometers, and Morgan coded in an Arduino board that basically specifies that at any given speed and at any given G loading, that this is where the flaps need to be. And then the flaps are basically they hunt around for the optimal spot until they get there.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, it's really, really cool, and it's actually kind of interesting because I learned the Duck Hawk is the first flapped glider I've ever flown, and they got the system fully working in 2014. So I mean, they had it was in development for a little while, and they had to make adjustments and things like that. But they got it working when I showed up in California in Montague at a 15-meter nationals, and then I got to fly it kind of before and after they put the system in, and then only after then did I fly any other manual flapped gliders, like the LS6 and the LS3 and the LAC 17. And so I can say with pretty good confidence that I'm probably the only person that's ever learned how to use manual flaps by virtue of watching how a computer does it. So,
Oh, wow. Right.
and it's actually pretty cool. The really big difference actually is the flaps. They mirror the motion on the stick to a large degree. So when you pull back, you not only are you slowing down, but you load up the glider. So you make the glider go to 1.5 to 2.5 G, whatever, however hard you pull into a thermal, for instance. And the thing is when you incur that load on the glider, that very significantly changes the angle of attack. And the thing that a lot of people don't realize is flaps are significantly affected by angle of attack, not by airspeed. So they'll have like a chart that tells them at these airspeeds that this is what the flap setting ought to be, right? Well, not so fast. It's actually that when you pull back, that adjusts quite a bit because your angle of attack is quite a bit higher than if you were just cruising along stably at a given speed. And so when you pull, and especially if you pull pretty firmly, when you do that, that actually greatly minimizes the drag associated with these kinds of maneuvers. So if you're certainly if you're smooth and you just make very gentle pulls, then it really doesn't make all that much of a difference. The flap speeds are pretty consistent. But if you make a pretty hard pull, if you don't pull the flaps at the same time in a flap glider, you're giving up quite a lot. Especially if you're doing this a lot. And I learned that, quite distinctly by observing how the flaps worked in the Duck Hawk.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
Yeah, but it's a cool ship.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Wow. Well, Daniel, thank you for sharing your blog.
My pleasure.
I really enjoyed the latest one, Tale of Two Air Masses, and definitely be checking back with you again and hear your next blog. I'm looking forward to what that's going to be about.
Sounds good. Actually, I'm the thing that I'm working on right now is more of going back to a theoretical post. Actually, it's on how goes back into risk management in a way, and how to manage your strategic reserves, and when it comes to energy, and both. Physical in the sense of a glider, and psychological, physiological, in terms of yourself as a pilot, as an athlete. And so, maybe in about a week or something like that, you'll see that come out.
All right, looking forward to hearing about it.
All right.
Hi, it's Natalie Flygirl Kelly.
And Fly Alyssa.
We are female pilots, aviation lovers, and hosts of the podcast, Cockpits and Cocktails.
We use this podcast as a way of sharing our journeys in aviation and allowing other females in aviation to share their amazing, inspiring stories as well.
Please give us a listen and join us for this fun, informative podcast with adventure and humor weaved in.
Blue skies.
Cheers.
We will join our next guest pilot next, but first our Soaring Safety segment with Enis Englehardt from Berlin, Germany.
We all know that flying can be dangerous and risky, of course. Also, all the gliders, they tell themselves, driving a car on the highway, it's even more dangerous than gliding. But you have to know, you have to be trained all the time to think about safety. If you start in season with flying again, then you have to think about safety, all the rules, all the checks you have to do first before you start with your gliders. You have to have the knowledge about the flying and the air traffic. Take your time to be prepared and stay trained all the time. And therefore, I think it's a good thing to fly safe.
If you'd like to check out the rest of Enis's story, you can check out episode 51, Strong Thermals, Big Sink. If you'd like to sponsor our Soaring Safety segment, you can contact me at chuck@soaringthesky.com. Todd Chapman joins us today from the Central Coast Soaring Club just to the north of his home in Sydney, Australia. He just started gliding a few months ago and recently achieved his first solo. However, this comes off the back of a long career in leadership roles in the airline industry, as well as some power flying in the 90s. Todd reflects on why he has taken up this new interest and how gliding could really see a surge of fresh interest during COVID, as many professional pilots are looking to scratch their aviation itch while grounded. Join us now for Todd Chapman on Soaring the Sky. Todd Chapman, welcome to Soaring the Sky. I'm so happy to have you today. I've been talking to you for a little bit, emailing back and forth, so here we are.
Great to be here, Chuck.
Where are you flying out of?
I'm in Australia, and I'm flying out of a little club that's just to the north of Sydney. It's called the Central Coast Soaring Club. It's actually at a place called Mangrove Mountain. And when we think of mountains in Australia, we're not necessarily thinking of, European Alps or the Himalayas. Mangrove Mountain is literally just 1,000 foot above sea level, just inland from the coast, to the north of Sydney. And it's this sort of rural farmland area surrounded by a national park. And it's a strip that's around about, from memory, I think it's about 1,100 metres total length, north-south orientation, but it's kind of shaped like a banana. So there's different runway orientations if you're landing to the south than if you're landing to the north, by around about 20 degrees offset. And included in that banana shape, there's a nice little crest in the middle. So you can't see one end to the other when you're actually at the northern end looking south, or vice versa. Included on that, just like the shape of a banana, I guess, you've also got the little stub, which is the stem at the top of the banana, which is another short couple of hundred metres that almost orientates itself almost east-west at the northern end. So it's an unusual shape, and that's the Central Coast Club. It's obviously a fully grass strip, and it's surrounded by trees immediately around it, and every boundary is actually trees on either side, which does mean that you've got a degree of turbulence that you've got to contend with when you have crosswinds or decent winds, in addition to the other challenges of the strip. But what I like about it, Chuck, is that it's close to home, 37 minutes drive from my house exactly, and that sort of accessibility is pretty cool for me.
Yeah, that makes it very nice.
It does. In actual fact, with respect to options that you have around Sydney, and Sydney's a big city, it's 4 million people. With respect to options that people have for gliding as a sport, there's three. Our one is the one that I've just described. There's another one that's down to the southwest, at a place called Camden, Southern Cross Gliding Club or Soaring Club. And there is another one out to the far west, which is at an Air Force base called Richmond. And so, anybody in Sydney would have to do, unless you're lucky enough to live close like I do to the northern one, for most of the city of the 4 million people, most people would be up for a decent drive in order to go gliding.
So how did your aviation adventure begin?
My aviation, okay, so I reckon most of your podcast would suffer from the same condition that I suffer from, which is having an aviation itch that needs to be scratched. And even as a little kid, I inherited that itch off my uncle Peter. It started to manifest itself. My earliest memory of it manifesting itself, I was born in 1967, and I think in 1974, if my years are correct, the Concorde did a promotional tour of the world. They were trying the British and the French governments were trying to drum up interest to sell Concordes. And I remember as a little kid, I lived in at the time I was living at literally on the harbour, actually, down here in Sydney, not too far from where the airport is. And I remember staying in the backyard all day because my parents had read in the newspaper that the Concorde was visiting that day, and I desperately wanted to see Concorde come in. And for me, that's the first memory I have of the manifestation of the interest. And regrettably, as it would turn out, the Concorde would actually land from the south and not go over my house, so I didn't actually see it, which is the other memory. But I was one of those people that was perpetually interested in anything to do with aviation, whether it was craning out of the window when you were lucky enough to go on a flight in those early days, whether it was seeing friends or family off, I would always ask if I could go to the airport to pick them up or drop them off. Whether it was an air show that you heard about that was coming up, you'd be pestering your dad and your mum to take you to the air show. Whether it was you're on a family holiday and you see the word airport or aerodrome on a road sign and you're just craning your neck to see the action, whatever the action may be. Whether it was spending your pocket money building initially, I guess, plastic kits and then working through to balsa wood kits that would fly, and I couldn't afford radio control, so I was flying control line kits back then. Every way I could manifest my flying interest back in those early days, I was manifesting it. As I grew older, in fact, when I was a late teenager, I was lucky enough to have 2 flights with my best mate at the time. His mum got remarried, and she would remarry a guy called Neil Fisher, who was very big in Gliding Australia at the time, and he took us out on 2 occasions. And I was very lucky enough to fly in Atlantic back in the 80s, just on 2 flights, on two separate occasions, but it really caught my interest. As you would imagine, all it did was actually deepen my interest, I should say, because the interest was already well and truly there, which is probably why he took me out. But as the years would progress, I remember when I left school, I actually left school and just I didn't connect the ability to earn a living with this white hot passion that I had. I don't know why I didn't. I just didn't. And I did all sorts of jobs for around about 10 years, working on boats in Sydney Harbour, removing asbestos out of buildings, a painter, working as a bricklayer, working as a landscaper, working in welfare, looking after disabled people and poor people, all sorts of different jobs. And then at the age of 26, when I was just about to marry my wife Jo, I thought, oh well, it's I better start to get serious here and think about what I'm going to do long term. And that was the time that I thought, I made the connection actually, Chuck, and I thought, well, I really should. If I was smart, I'd actually do for a job what I'm actually passionate about and have this burning desire to participate in, which is aviation. Like a lot of people, actually, the road to starting to participate in aviation, and I'm talking about aviation as a career here, they immediately think, as I did, that therefore you'll want to be a pilot. So I actually started to do power flying, and I did it for 2 years. I did a diploma of aeronautics concurrently with learning to fly power aircraft. I got 170 hours, like well and truly, got my private license, and I was chugging away towards getting my commercial license. But what I found was that the more that I was flying my solo hours, getting ready to sit my commercial test, and then looking, obviously, subsequently, once you get your commercial license, then as I guess the career path was for Australians in the mid-90s, that if you wanted to fly commercially, you would basically take that single-engine power license and then try to get single-engine hours and accumulate hours. Then, if you're lucky enough to get enough, you'd then get your first twin piston job, and then you'd get enough twin piston hours to try and get your next twin turbine job, maybe a pressurized aircraft. And then, you'd have to, this would be a couple of years before you really were eligible even to start to participate in any recruitment that the airlines might be doing. So I was getting, I guess, more and more exposure to the notion of flying as a single pilot. And as I was getting my hours up, and I found that the single pilot environment, the cockpit environment, really, Chuck, it probably wasn't the best of me was not going to be found in flying an aeroplane for a job. I certainly didn't really enjoy the highly disciplined, repetitive nature of the cockpit, and I much preferred, I guess, what would subsequently become an alternative career on the ground, where I was able to exercise some of the other parts of my brain, particularly those around, I guess I'm a high extrovert, so working with people, and also the business aspects of working on the ground in the aviation context. So after a few years of just getting that time up, and I guess learning that lesson around that flying wasn't for me, I then made a mid-course correction and started to pursue an aviation career on the ground. Initially, I worked for a little airline called Hazleton Airlines. It was a fantastic little outfit. We operated Saabs, Saab 340s and Metro 23s around regional New South Wales and down a little bit into Victoria here in Australia. And a high camaraderie, incredible sense of, I guess, underdog, faithfulness to the brand by the people. After a couple of years there, I was lucky enough to be offered a job in Qantas, which is Australia's national carrier. Imagine most people would have heard of Qantas Airways or Qantas Airlines on this podcast. And I've been at Qantas now. In fact, I clicked over 20 years just a couple of weeks ago. And I've worked in all sorts of different jobs inside Qantas. I've enjoyed a fantastic career. I've been very blessed, actually. Worked in pretty much every department up to senior levels in what is one of Australia's greatest brands, and I think one of the world's greatest airlines, the second oldest airline in the world. And everybody that works for Qantas is extremely passionate about Qantas, and it brings a huge amount of energy just working for such a prominent brand within Australia. And that's where I am. And so I've, for the last, 25 years from when I started learning to fly, for those first few years, then Hazleton, and now 20 years at Qantas, I've been very, very blessed that my aviation itch has been scratched every single day. And there's not a day that I go to work where I don't feel energized and excited about what I'm working on, or what I get to do. Frankly, I also look back on many frequent occasions through my career and to have what I call pinch yourself moments where, when I was a kid and I would dream about the sort of stuff that I would like to do, now as an adult, the amount of things that I get to do and I've participated in as a leader in Qantas, I just go, oh my goodness, I can't believe the kid that was just in the backyard looking up at the sky waiting for Concorde is now, for example, bringing aircraft out of Victorville and bringing them into service in Australia, negotiating engine deals with Rolls-Royce, working on some strategic opportunities on how we do heavy maintenance on our aircraft, working in crisis management on various things such as how we're going to manage COVID, all the things that I've had the opportunity to participate in and lead in Qantas it's just been fantastic. And as I say, I've had a very, very blessed career.
Absolutely. Being able to work in aviation must be very exciting.
It is, mate. It is. People are. There's a general high level of energy. You find that you work with people. The way that a lot of us at my job talk about it is that we're all, in a sense, you'd end up being a little bit of a brand ambassador. In Australia, it seems that everybody has got an opinion on Qantas. You'll go to a barbecue and have the inevitable barbecue conversations, and everybody has got an idea of how they think Qantas should be run, or they'll give you some feedback, good or bad, on a flight that they've had recently, or they wish Qantas was going to Rome again, and why aren't we going to Rome, etc. It's one of those. We're like being a Qantas employee, you're a bit of a lightning rod to always have these conversations at barbecues, and as a consequence, I think every Qantas employee ends up being a little bit of a brand ambassador wherever you go, not just at work, of course, but even off work.
So what brought you back to the glider port after all those years?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. So as everybody in the podcast would be aware, the world of aviation is currently under a huge amount of stress, and I've actually I've had the opportunity. I'll actually be leaving Qantas at the end of the calendar year by choice. So my 20 years, as I said, just clicked over the other day. And I think it's time for me to explore new horizons that may exist in my career. But I'm very conscious that I have that aviation itch that I need to scratch every day. So as I sort of work towards a time in my career where I may not be working in aviation because, well, frankly, there's not a lot of recruitment going on in aviation at the moment, not necessarily a lot of opportunity. So therefore, I don't have the guarantee that my next role will be somewhere involving the industry. I thought, well, I really should do something as a hobby and an interest that satisfies that. And I looked around and I thought, well, funny enough, Chuck, the notion of power flying, it didn't really appeal to me that much, and I really can't work out why. But power flying, it didn't. The notion of going power flying, in a single engine, Cessna Piper or whatever, it didn't really float my boat. But what really piqued my interest was the notion of doing some gliding. So I knew this club that I've now joined. I knew it existed because, in fact, some of my relatives live not too far from it. So when we would visit those relatives, I would see the airfield and see the gliders in action. So I knew where it was, and I also knew how close it was to my house, which is pretty close. So I thought, actually, I'm going to give gliding a go. And this, by the way, this story only goes back around about 4 months. So we're not dealing with. I'm not professing for a second that I've got anywhere near the experience in gliding that, frankly, most of your listeners would have. Absolutely the opposite. If anything, I'm an enthusiastic newcomer to this particular arm of aviation. But I gave these guys a ring. They were really, really lovely and welcoming. They said, yeah, we're flying today. This was on a particular Saturday about 4 months ago. They said, yeah, rock on up. So I came up that day and just basically met with a bunch of like-minded people that were, highly energized and passionate about the sport of gliding. I think I had 2 flights that day, if I'm not mistaken, and I joined the club that afternoon. Because I
Nice.
thought, why waste any time? I'll just sign up right today and pay my money, and I was away. And the other thing I should mention I failed to mention actually about the Central Coast Soaring Club. We're a winch only club. I should have mentioned that actually. So that banana shape.
Oh, winch only.
Yeah, banana shape. Yeah, the reason for that is I did mention that the club itself, it's surrounded by trees on every side, but there is some rural activity that goes on with small farms, etc. And so consequently, the actual land is owned by the council, so the local government, and there is a degree of how would you put it, community relationships that need to be appropriately managed. And so having powered aircraft chugging in and chugging out on the weekends would probably not work with those relationships. Plus, there'd be, I think, a new level of formality associated with getting powered aircraft in and out of the site with respect to regulatory requirements that, again, the council would potentially have, on a continuous basis, the council would have some concerns about. So consequently, yeah, it's a winch only club.
Yeah, and without the winch, you obviously wouldn't be a club there at all. It doesn't sound like.
No, well, without the winch, you'd probably have to use self-powered gliders, which again have a degree of noise that, if used on a continuous basis, we do have actually one. We have a Demona available in the club, but that's not used, and frankly, it's it'd be a lot quieter than say something like a Pawnee taking off 20 times a day, as you'd appreciate.
So, how was that first launch there at the club?
That's a really great question. It's funny you obviously asked that question because there's something about everybody's first winch launch. It was in a Pukatek, which is a little old Polish aluminium glider, which is one of 2 that the club has got. So I remember sitting in the front seat, and as you'd appreciate, for someone who's flown a lot in small aircraft like Cessna 152, for example, the cockpit of a glider feels smaller yet again. You actually slot yourself in there. It's like you put a glider on. You don't sit in it. You put it on. I'm a a big frame guy. I'm 100 kilos, 6'3", so I'm filling the space. And the canopy goes down, and the canopy just sort of nestles. Just you can almost feel it on the top of your head, so you're really right inside it. And the cable is connected. You hear the sort of rattling of the ring, and then you had that inevitable waiting sort of thing between 10 to 20 seconds for the cables to be the slack to be taken up. And then, so it's all this anticipation, and all your sensations are building. I remember it really clearly. When the acceleration occurred, the first 5 meters are quite gentle, because I think the person who's driving the club is just still continuing to feel the tension. But then the acceleration just comes on like you wouldn't believe, and you're airborne. I'm estimating within about just potentially as quick as 50 meters, which again is extremely fast. You accelerate horizontally just a little bit further, and then obviously put the person flying. And I wasn't flying this first takeoff. Obviously, my instructor Graham was in the back seat behind me, and then the next thing you know, within a few short seconds, it feels like you're going up vertically. Obviously, you're not going up vertically. We know that. Physics say that that's not the case, but I can tell you right now, it feels vertical. Have you ever done a winch launch, Chuck?
No, I have not. I'm looking forward to it. It sounds exhilarating.
It is exhilarating. There's nothing like your first one, and the worst bit on this first one for me was that the ring connected the ring that was obviously in the tow hook underneath, which in the Pukatek's probably approximately under the rear pilot's. But it's pretty close to the CFG, actually. The ring actually, how would I put it? It actually rotated just probably about 10 degrees, just as it settled. The ring settled as the glider actually was going through the climb phase. So it made this really loud clunk sound. Just as the ring moved, it was all safe. The ring did right, and like as to someone who's all the sensations in you go, oh my goodness! I literally thought to myself, oh my goodness, is that the spark starting to give way? But the scenery as you're going up, you're going up 55 knots, pretty close to vertical. I'm not. I know it's not 90 degrees, but you're going up very, very steep at a very decent speed, 55 odd knots. So the scenery falls away extremely quickly. It's just amazing. And then you actually, I presumed you'd actually get some sort of zero G at the top. And again, as you go over the top, and I was surprised that the actual that last 20% of the whole launch experience is actually done well. It's actually relatively anticlimactic. You get pretty close to where the tug is. You got probably another 100 meters of horizontal difference between you and the tug. You've now pretty much leveled out. You've given away all your climbing. It's time to let go of the cable. You lower the nose so the cable's not too tense. Pull the cable release, and down she goes, and all of a sudden it becomes a lot quieter as well, because you're sort of holding the nose up, getting your speed back, and settling back in at least the Pukatek, nice gentle 45 odd knots, and which is again a lot less noisy than the climb, because the wind is now the airspeed is now reduced.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's all over, and it's just all over and done. It's so quick and as you say, I think the word exhilarating, I completely describe it as that. When you start to do more and more, and when I say sound like I'm talking my experience up, I'm absolutely not. I've probably only done about 20 around about 20 winch launches in my total career so far. But after a while, you do start to feel you never become used to them completely, but you certainly don't. You don't become the nervousness that you have about them actually drops off very quickly, and that little clunk with the ring settling, I notice happens quite often, and you just go, that's just the ring settling. I don't need to worry about that anymore.
Wow, so you do all that, right? And then at the end of the day, you're like, yeah, I'm going to sign up for this. Yeah,
exactly. It ticked every box for me. It was the club, a really nice, really lovely group of people. The culture is is really it's fantastic. Actually, it's the I should mention the other thing that really appealed to me about gliding over the power flying is I over the years I've also liked to dabble a little bit in sailing, and I'm talking about little dinghies actually rather than super yachts, and I just love the idea, and this is the essence of gliding over power for me. I love the idea that you totally rely on nature to make yourself successful, just like when you're sailing a yacht. The notion that you're actually connecting into energy that originally comes from the sun, turns into some form of energy in the air, whether it's thermals or horizontal wind, which obviously creates ridge lift or waves, all of which is just energy conversion that you've got to participate in order to either sustain flight or go from A to B. I really love that connection with nature, and the fact that you've actually got to think about and concentrate on your environment in order to participate in that conversion. I know I've probably made it sound a little bit over scientific. If anything, it's more artistic. But I love the notion of that, and frankly, I also love the way that the gliders aerodynamically. I love the optics of the gliders, because they've got to they've absolutely taken a new level of streamlining that you obviously can't necessarily do in a powered aircraft, because you've got a bloody engine on the thing, or alternatively you don't need to be as fussy with a powered aircraft, because frankly you've got an engine on the thing, so you're not necessarily looking to get everything you can to reduce drag and improve your to get the optimize your LD on a powered aircraft. And I love the way, in order to get the best participation in the energy that's available in the atmosphere, the glider ends up with this beautiful optical look of just streamlining. And I think that's a really nice element of the sport as well. It looks pretty.
It does. And, even the gliders that have been around for 20 years, they look like they just came out of the hangar and they were just built. It's like they were ahead of their time. When I first time I saw one of the glass ships, I was like, wow, how old is that? What's 20? It can't be 20 years old.
I know. In actual fact, I was up at this. We had this gliding camp 2 weeks ago, a place called Gloucester in New South Wales. It's actually hosted by my club, but other clubs. We all get together at this place called Gloucester, which is about 3 or 2.5 hours north of Sydney. And just quickly about Gloucester, actually, because it's a little interesting story there. So Gloucester is inland, around about 3/4 an hour inland from the coast. Latitude-wise, as I say, it's about 2.5 hours north of Sydney, and it's actually at the base of one of the coldest parts of Australia, which is not in the Australian Alps. I'm not sure if you're aware, actually, but Australia's got this area called the Australian Alps, and in actual fact, I believe our Australian Alps cover more surface area than the Swiss Alps do, and indeed our Australian Alps even have snow, but they're nowhere near as spectacular as the Swiss Alps. But we do have our own ski season, and we do have our own ski fields, but they're very modest, so don't get me wrong. But outside of that, we do have small pockets of Australia that experience snow, and the area near Gloucester is also one of those pockets. The other thing about Australia is one of the most ancient parts of it's one of the most, I guess, it's the continent of Australia is part of, I guess, original Gondwana land, and from when the globe was basically just one continent millions and millions and billions of years ago. And Australia has been largely unaffected by other continents bumping into it, compared to, for example, Asia, where India bumped into it, and obviously the Himalayas were created, etc. So Australia is a relatively massively flat country, and the mountains that we do have are consequently quite eroded. So therefore, it's unusual in Australia to get vertical cliff faces, or even cliff faces that have a very steep angle. So consequently, there isn't areas all around Australia where you can participate in ridge flying. It's not necessarily as common as you might think in a country of our size. Obviously, we are thermal heaven because of our arid nature, but ridge flying is not that common. But around about in the 80s, one of our club members was driving through Gloucester and noticed that there was this airstrip, and adjacent or even parallel to the airstrip, they also noticed that there was this 6 kilometre long ridge that rose up around about 2,000 foot above the surrounding terrain. And the legend has it, at the time of year that this is what was explained to me anyway when I was up at Gloucester, which I think is a really nice story. The individual who was also driving at this time also noticed that there was a prevailing wind from the west, which then he looked at it and goes, actually, there's probably some good ridge lift on this particular hill. And the airstrip, being right next to the ridge, is perfectly co-located. The airstrip was for the Gloucester Aero Club, which is a power club traditionally. Anyway, so it lent to this individual organising a camp, and the camp has been run every year ever since. People just tow their gliders in, assemble them on site. A powered aircraft, a tug, I should say, comes in and provides the aero tows. And and it's a great experience for everybody to try their hand at ridge soaring in an environment where there's incredibly high predictability in August of the westerly winds. And because, as I say, because of the shape of the ridge, it then creates a great opportunity for some easy to find lift, which is what I did 2 weeks ago as well. And that was great fun. It was really good fun.
Oh, nice. So that's your first experience in ridge lift.
Yeah, except for, ironically, when I was a kid flying those models, I suggested that I was into control line, but I did have a 2-channel radio control aircraft as well. And ironically, I was actually doing slope soaring, as we called it back in the 1980s. I was doing a little bit of slope soaring with my model, so I did have an understanding, at least from model flying, around the principles involved. But yeah, that was my first experience in actually flying actually in proper ridge soaring. In actual fact, the lift you can get there, it's quite impressive. I think last year, one of the gliders actually got up to 18,000 feet above the because a nice little wave developed, and they managed to ride the wave all the way up to 18,000 feet before they came down. So there is the opportunity to get some decent altitude out of some of the conditions.
Oh, nice. So that's what's the elevation of that small ridge there?
The ground level is 1,000 foot AGL, and then the ridge itself is roughly 3,000 from memory. So it's only the ridge itself. The ridge itself is less than, it might go up to 2,500 above the ground. So it's certainly less than a kilometre off the prevailing terrain. So the ridge itself is not particularly high, but there is other mountains that are available in 20 k's away as well. So the combination of the terrain can, with the right wind conditions, can produce a nice wave. I've been, as has been explained to me from the stories that I heard from the previous year.
So what were you doing down at Lake Keep It? I know you were down there for a little bit.
Oh yeah, sure. That's actually how we connected, wasn't it? It was just that Keep It email. So Keep It offer a there's an upside and I guess a downside with the winch launching in my home club. In winter, off a winch launch, you don't necessarily have a high likelihood of hitting a thermal every time you launch. So consequently, a lot of the winch launches in winter off my home club end up in being a 6 or 7 minute experience, a sled ride until you sort of come back down. Additionally, I guess we are, there is a degree to which the aircraft that we're operating with the Pukatech, obviously they don't have self-sustaining engines either, and they're old training aircraft too, so they're not necessarily going to get any more than 6 or 7 minutes off even a 1,600 foot AGL release, and that's cool. Also, when I was learning, I've only been back in the sport since June. I think it was June that first flight was. So, gosh, what are we in now? Later, yeah, it's like 3 months actually. So I obviously June down here in Australia, we're in the depths of winter as well. So my entire gliding experience has actually been in winter. Obviously, there's not as much available energy in the atmosphere. So consequently, I was looking at the timeline of my predicted acquired experience and how long it would take me to reach solo, and I thought, wow, with two flights a day when I go flying, because obviously we're all taking turns and helping each other out, and with 2 flights a day, it's going to take me a long time to go solo. Arguably, I was potentially an impatient fellow, but I thought, well, is there a way that I can actually fast track this? And I had a look around, and I found out that up at Lake Keepit, they offer a 1 week intense training course. The idea is you live in Lake Keepit's around about 4.5 hours from my house here, and entirely inland, northwest anyway. You basically pay a deposit, it covers your accommodation, and then you live in, and you have access, obviously, to the club facilities, which are fantastic, actually, as is the accommodation. Day starts with a daily briefing. Then you hit the flying, and the flying is through an aerotow. And there's probably 3 advantages. Firstly, you're doing this day in and day out for a week, so you very quickly build up muscle memory and momentum, as compared to learning to fly by 1 or 2 little drips every weekend. You're obviously drinking from a fire hose when it comes to the learning experience. The second one is, compared to the winch flying, being able to aerotow at that early stages is very helpful. It was very helpful for me because you can obviously choose your release height, and even if you don't get any lift, you're getting more than a 6 or 7 minute flight. So there's more learning opportunities per launch with time in the air. And the third thing is that even the third advantage of Keep It is that even in winter, as I would subsequently find, there is actually decent lift around. I can only imagine what it would be like in summer, but there is lift around, so you can actually, if it's a little bit harder to find, I guess, but you're able to stay up there for decent periods of time while continuing to learn again off the same launch. That's why I looked into and subsequently chose Keep It as the experience. So because I wanted to fast track and get myself to solo, just to build up momentum rather than just that little drip feed alternative. And indeed, yeah. So my experience in Keep It, I did solo, which was really, really satisfying. And I guess it's not everyone that can say that they've soloed twice in their career, but yeah, naturally I soloed a powered aeroplane. But soloing a glider, Chuck, is quite a different experience. And so I'll count that as my second time that I've soloed.
What is your local club there doing to help the sport of soaring?
Well, it's funny you should say that. I was actually talking to our chief flying instructor about that the other day, about what's the strategic direction of the club. I think my story around somebody who's been involved in aviation now as I'm 53, so somebody who's mature age and where they are in their career, starting to get into it. There's not too many hobbies or interests that I think attract people like gliding does in this particular and my particular demographic, but gliding is one of those. And I was actually talking to CFI because I imagine that in the world of aviation, and even in the business of aviation, and even I think for a lot of pilots for a long time to come, we're going to have a pilot surplus with the economic contraction around certainly global, but even a degree of domestic flying. There is going to be a lot of pilots that are looking for alternative jobs for a while, and those guys, and I know a lot of pilots, those guys have got aviation itches that they need to scratch as well. They're passionate about what they do. And so I think that there is going to be a lot of opportunity for gliding, if it plays its cards right, to become a source of accessible flying, and accessible in the sense that the actual act of flying the airplanes is pretty cheap. Even the act of owning the airplanes is pretty cheap. If you want to even go ahead and own a glider, there are more expensive hobbies you can actually have. And so I think there's a real opportunity to promote the sport to people who are in the industry, who are having a bit of a furlough from actually doing flying or working on or participating in it as a job, who still are passionate about flying, and they could actually do what I'm doing and actually exercise that through doing it for fun as a hobby, while they potentially work in another industry for a while, waiting for aviation to return. So at this stage, the club, to answer your core question, Chuck, at this stage, our club has been very lucky in that there's been a number of new people that have joined the club, and there's a high level of energy and enthusiasm from a number of new people that are just like myself, who have come along for. To be honest with you, I'm the only one that's come out of aviation so far out of the guys I'm thinking of. But the opportunity to potentially strategically target some people in the demographic that I've just described, I think, is there. We need to think about how to do it in a way that doesn't overcrowd the club and the facilities beyond the point where it would become congested and then degrade the experience for everyone, because you don't want to be turning up to the airfield and have so many people there that there is only one flight available on the Saturday. That's probably, ironically, that's one form of success leading to frustration for another form of experience for others. So just getting the balance right is important.
Yeah, we should have plenty of tow pilots, right?
That's a good point.
It's like some of the clubs, like our club, in the past, we've definitely had that struggle where we just didn't have the tow pilot. So there's a lot of, depending on your club and how it works. I mean, the way ours is, they're like a service member, so we don't charge them to come fly. They basically get to come fly free, after they're checked out and everything's good. They get to fly free as a tow pilot. They get to be in the air and continue to fly. So it's a great opportunity.
I'm not sure about your observation, but my observation is a lot of the tow pilots are young kids that are trying to get their hours up in order to get progress their commercial pilot license in order to get an airline job. And ironically, the incentive for those guys to be doing this right now isn't strong, because, well, there ain't going to be an airline job at the end, because we're going to have a glut of airline qualified pilots in the system for a long while to come. But I think you're right. You'll find that your joke, I think, is a good observation, that you might find a lot of the airline pilots, again, might reacquaint themselves with an old tail wheel piston engine endorsement, and potentially even a latent tug endorsement, and even help out just so that they can actually have a go every weekend at flying, polling an aircraft just for the fun of it. It's a good point.
Get in the air,
Yeah, exactly. I'd want to do it if I was a guy who had was passionate and was flying for a job and then couldn't fly. Man, it'd drive me crazy. I'd be desperate to have a fang at anything.
Todd, did you want to give a shout out? I always ask if someone wants to give a shout out before we close things up here at the end of the show.
Yeah, I will. I want to give a shout out. Probably thank you for this. And this is I hadn't instinctively, I know who to shout out. I would shout out. Frankly, I'd shout out my wife, who's always very supportive. My wife Jo, who's incredibly supportive with all my hobbies and interests, and I'm very blessed that she's my life partner. But at the Central Coast Flying Club, there's two guys that just the bedrocks of the place that I deal with all the time. There's the chief flying instructor, Graham Martin, and a senior instructor, Mike Woolley. Both Mike is actually 80 years old, but he's as energetic and as involved as anyone. I love Mike's approach to life, and the fact that he's such an intensively passionate person about the sport and promoting the sport, and also seeing people come through the club and just nurturing young students through to learning to fly. And Graham, and both these guys are obviously volunteers who give so much of their own time and expect nothing back except satisfaction. And Graham Martin, the chief flying instructor, again, he's a really interesting guy with so many stories out of his life, which has been intrinsically linked, never professionally involved with aviation as a career, but has just always been involved with aviation as a passion and something he does in a big way on the side. And their contribution to the club and their the knowledge that they share willingly and the selflessness with which they serve the club, I think, deserves a shout out. So big thanks to Mike and Graham.
Yeah, a lot of people in the soaring world do it because of the passion. It's not about the money, that's for sure.
that's what you see.
Todd, thank you so much for telling your story here on Soaring the Sky. It's been great to have you.
Oh, it's been really nice to be asked, Chuck, and thank you for doing this podcast. I will finally say that your podcasts have been a source of keeping me awake at night. Sometimes I try to listen to podcasts in order to help me doze off, but because your podcasts have got such interesting people, I constantly find myself lying in bed awake, listening to your people being interviewed and finding a great source of inspiration from the very interesting people that you have on board. So hopefully I've contributed to that in some small way.
Absolutely, and thank you. I don't want to keep you up at night, but I'm glad you're listening.
Good on you, Chuck.
If you would like to say hi, just drop Chuck a line at chuck@soaringthesky.com, or you can send us a note on the website, soaringthesky.com. Also, if you're a pilot, we want to hear your story. Just send us an email and Chuck will get in touch with you. We hope you join us next week for another great guest and adventure on Soaring the Sky. Music for the podcast was written and produced by Kim Spangler. Voiceover work was provided by Michelle Perez. Graphic design for the podcast was created by Zachary Fulton.